video, we're going to be talking about how I make my clay earrings. A bit of a disclaimer before we get started. This is just my personal process. Everyone really does it differently. There's so many methods out there. I just wanted to make this video to shed a bit of light on my personal process. This video will be divided into several sections, so feel free to jump to whichever part of the video you're most curious about. There will also be timestamps linked below as well. We'll first discuss the materials I use. We'll talk a bit about how I design them. We'll talk about sculpting, then we'll talk about painting, then we'll talk about glazing, we'll talk about assembling everything with the earring findings, and the very last section will just be a little Q&A where I touch upon questions that I got on Instagram that I wasn't able to fit into the video. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's get into all of the information. Here is everything I use. I like to use Japanese air dry clay. I also have a bunch of clay cutters. I have parchment paper and a rolling pin. I also use various different kinds of surgical steel findings, Turner acrylic gouache paint. I have a bunch of different pom-poms and beads I use to accessorize the earrings. And I have these different pliers I use to assemble. And I use Padico Sealer Supergloss to glaze everything. So step one is to design. Before I start sculpting the earring charms, I like to design it beforehand. There's a lot of different earring styles out there that require different kinds of studs and findings and attachments to make it all work. For example, if you're just making a single stud earring that doesn't have any kind of attachments, all you have to worry about is sculpting out the clay and then gluing that stud to the earring. But if you're making something a bit more complex, that is a dangly earring, you want to think about how all the different pieces are going to connect together. For example, are you going to poke a hole in both the charms and connect it with the jump ring? Are you going to stick an eye pin through it and have them all connect and interlock like that? The reason I say this rather than just like going for it and sculpting out is because there's been so many times where I've been sculpting and the clay has been baked or dried at that point, and then I'll realize, oh, I should have inserted a pin here or poked a hole there. So basically planning ahead can save you a lot of time in the future. Another benefit of planning ahead is that you can plan out all your colors beforehand. This is just a personal preference, but I like to take out my iPad and plan out what colors I'm going to paint on my charms so I have more of a cohesive color scheme, but that's totally up to you. So after you have your idea all set and you kind of know where you're going to interlock things, I move on to the next step, which is sculpting. So all of the earrings I make nowadays are made with Padico Premier Air Dry Clay. This is a Japanese brand. I find it to be super high quality and I really like working with it. You can absolutely use polymer clay for this step. It's actually what I used to use, but I ended up switching to air dry clay because it works well with my preferred sealer and it is lighter, which is actually very important to me when it comes to making earrings. Air dry clay can be a bit more tricky than polymer clay, especially if you've never used it before, but my first tip I have for you is to try using clay cutters. This also goes for polymer clay. These little guys have saved me so much time. I used to spend ages struggling with my X-Acto knife and all the charms would be different sizes. The clay cutter ensures that all of the charms you stamp out will be the same size. I get all of my clay cutters off of Etsy. There are a bunch of different Etsy shops that sell different kinds of clay cutters, so I just recommend typing in the shape you're looking for, like house clay cutter on Etsy, and then you'll find a bunch of different options. You can also use tiny cookie cutters, and I've also seen people make them themselves by like folding aluminum foil, but I was just too lazy to do that, so I just got them off of Etsy. So after I stamp them all out, I take a bit of water and I smooth out the edges with my fingers because they tend to be a bit frayed on the edges after they're stamped out just because of how air dry clay works as a clay. I like to make sure everything is smooth using water, but if you want it to be a bit more textured or bumpy, that's totally your personal preference. And then after everything is smoothed out, I insert the earring finding I need for that particular earring design. I personally like to use these eye pins a lot and stick it through the entire charm, and I just think that it helps me feel more secure that nothing's gonna fall out. I also tend to make very dangly earrings where a lot of things connect and interlock, so by piercing the charm with an eye pin, I think it just helps everything connect. If there's not gonna be anything underneath it, I'll just use a shorter eye pin. I don't have a recommended thickness for how thick your charm should be. I think mine are all around 1 centimeter, maybe even less. I feel like my charms can be pretty flat, but again, that's totally your personal preference on how thick you want it to be. The last tip I have is to make sure your pieces lay flat before they start to bake or dry. Whether it's air dry clay or polymer clay, if your charm is a little bit tilted when it starts to bake or dry, they might end up looking a little bit warped. After everything's either dry and ready to paint, I like to add a little bit of Aleene's jewelry glue at the very top of the charm where the finding meets the clay piece. I do this because I'm a little bit paranoid that the charm is going to loosen off of the finding, so this helps me ensure that everything's going to stay secure. I used to not do this because I used to coat everything in UV resin, and UV resin is very strong, so I wouldn't have any worries that anything would loosen. But now that I don't use UV resin, I like to add that little bit of extra security. I also know some people like to take sandpaper and smooth out the charms or whatever clay thing they're working on before they proceed, which is totally up to you. If you find that your charms look a bit rough, if you see that a little bit is jutting out in a weird direction that you don't like, you can just take sandpaper and sand that out. So there's always options to edit the charm even after it's done drying or baking. Just be sure to wear a mask while you do it, because as you're sanding it out, there will be little tiny particles that come off of your clay piece, and it's good to wear a mask so you don't inhale it all. The next step is painting. I use acrylic gouache paint to paint all of my earring charm. Basically any kind of clay piece I make, I use acrylic gouache paint. Another reason why I like using air dry clay is because the paint gets soaked up into the clay much faster, and I tend to make a bunch of earrings in bulk, so this added time saver is very helpful in the long run. I like acrylic gouache paint because unlike acrylic paint, I find that it's more viscous, I find that it dries more smoothly, and there's less streaks in the charm. And unlike regular gouache paint, acrylic gouache paint is permanent. The brand I like to use is Turner. I like this brand because I feel like it's pretty high quality, and I like that it's more affordable than what I think a lot of artists out there use, which is the traditional Holbein acrylic gouache paints. I'll get them one day, but today is not that day. The painting process is very straightforward. Sometimes when I'm painting, I'll see that the surface of the charm looks chipped and cracked. I found that that might happen when there's not enough moisture in your paint, so I would just add another coat and make sure it has a good amount of water in it. Also, remember to have fun. I feel like painting is really where all your pieces come to life and everything gains its charm and personality. I also like to add a coat of white gouache paint before I begin painting, so there's like a nice base, but that's also optional. And if you find that the paint isn't as opaque as you like, just continue to build layers until it's to your satisfied opacity level. The next step is glazing. Back in the day, I used to use polymer clay and glaze my charms with UV resin. I know a lot of artists like to do this because UV resin gives you that plasticky, shiny feel. It's also smooth after it's done curing, if you end up curing it correctly. But I basically stopped using it because it's toxic and it was giving me a headache even though I was using all the right safety equipment. And I just found that it wasn't really worth it. But if you choose to go the route of glazing things with UV resin, please be safe. I feel like I see a lot of individuals in our crafting community not take proper safety precautions with resin, and it's just really important to. And I'm just saying this because I feel like I've had really bad headaches from using it, and I just want to make sure that you are safe. That means using a respirator, wearing gloves, having it touch your skin is not good, having a lot of ventilation in your space, crack open that window. And remember that a cloth or a surgical mask is not enough when using resin. You need a respirator with the correct kinds of cartridges. So after deciding that UV resin just really wasn't worth it for me and the headache wasn't worth it for me, I ended up switching to this glaze called Padico Sealer Super Gloss. This glaze is meant for air dry clay only and not polymer clay, so please keep that in mind if you choose to try out this gloss. It is not intended for polymer clay. This is because polymer clay has something called plasticizer in it, and it just basically reacts with the gloss in a way that might end up making your charm sticky over time. That being said, clay glazes are different for everybody. Some people use triple thick, some people use Mod Podge, a lot of artists use Varathane. For example, the room that you craft in could be more humid than somebody else's room, and that could impact how the glaze dries, and then your pieces could just end up really different. What you like, someone else might not like. But after a lot of trial and error and testing out glazes that I don't really like, I found that this really works the best for me. So how do I use this glaze? I know a lot of people recommend coating the whole thing and then hanging the charm on a bit of a paper clip or just letting it dry to hang. Personally, I find that this gloss is very watery and viscous. So when I do that method, the glaze sort of just drips down and gets everywhere. It also gets a bit tacky as it dries. So yeah, it just kind of turns into a mess. So what I do is I glaze one side of it, let that dry totally, turn it around, glaze the other side, let that dry totally, and then I turn it over and do the front side again. Another thing that I just mentioned is that this glaze becomes a little tacky during the curing process. If the glaze on your charm is a little tacky and it's touching the table while it dries, something that can happen is that the glaze will stick to your table, and then as you lift it, it'll rip off a chunk of your paint in the process, which is very frustrating, especially when I know a lot of times, at least for me, it takes a really long time to paint these charms. So that is even more reason why I'm super careful when I'm glazing to just glaze one side and do the other and then the other side. That way nothing drips down and doesn't make the charm stick to anything and ruin my paint. So after everything's all shiny and your charms are dry, it's now time for assembly. This step is going to look different just based on what designs you are going to set out to do. There are loads of YouTube videos online that just basically teach you how to make jewelry, how to connect things properly, how to make loops. So basically, if you're curious about something, I really recommend just entering a YouTube video like, how do I connect this to this? I assure you there will be so many YouTube videos on how to properly do it.
So in order to assemble, I have these chain nose pliers, I have round nose pliers, and then I also have cutters. So now let's assemble. Basically, how I make my dangly earrings is I just create little loops at the base of every charm, and then I'll just link them all together. In order to make a loop, I'll push one side of this eye pin, and then I will align the bottom of it flush against my round nose pliers, so you can see it's nice and flush. And then I'll just sort of twist it in the opposite direction that I pushed it in around the barrel in order to create a circular loop. This loop is not going to look amazing once you finish doing it, I mean, unless you're very skilled. But for me, it always looks a little weird, and I take my pliers and then I will just adjust accordingly into a better loop looking shape. This definitely takes a lot of practice, and I feel like I've definitely improved over time. Let's see that one more time. So I'll put it flush against the pliers, I'll twist into the loop, and then I have a little loop after some adjusting. So after I have my nice little loops at the base of my charms, I really think more about designing and how my different findings are gonna work. I take out different beads, I test the colors, and I see, oh, this might look better here, this might look better here. And then I decide where I want my linkages. So we have one linkage at the top and one linkage at the bottom, if that makes sense. So one for the hook and one for this bottom little fluffy part I have designed. I'll take a head pin. This is called a head pin because there is a flat piece of metal at the base of this pin. And this stops beads from falling all the way through. So it's great for the bottom of dangly earrings because you don't want any beads falling off of your earring. So this is me demonstrating how this teardrop bead stops right there, so it looks really great for my dangly earring. And the premise for making this into a loop is exactly the same. I push it to the side, align the bottom of my pin flush with my pliers, and then twist it in the opposite direction all the way around the barrel of the plier. And then in order to link everything together, you want to make sure that you push that loop forwards. I don't know if that makes any sense. You want to push it out or in front of you instead of pulling it to the side. This way the shape of your loop stays exactly the same and you don't compromise that loop that you took so long to create. And the same premise for my hook, I just sort of slip it on and then push it back into place, and then my earring's done. So this is basically my process for creating a lot of different earrings.
Step is definitely my favorite part because I like picking different beads and accessories. I really feel like my creativity can bloom in this step of the process. I source most of my beads from Joann's and different Etsy shops. I also recently started experimenting with pom-poms because I became really inspired by Natasha, or Sad Shrimps. She makes really cool earrings. I highly recommend you check her out if you don't know who she is already. Natasha's earrings really inspired me and just kind of opened my eyes to all the possibility that there is in designing earrings. So yeah, there's all different kinds of different beads and materials and textures to experiment with. So yeah, I really recommend you go wild and just use your imagination and think of all the different kinds of shapes and textures you can mix and match to design earrings. And after you attach the hooks, you're basically done. It's really not that long of a process. It just really depends on how many earrings you're making. And again, please keep in mind, this is not the only way to make earrings. There's so many different methods out there. Yeah, I highly recommend just experimenting and trying different things out. If you have an idea, just go for it, because I feel like a lot of learning and getting better at crafting is just trying it out and learning from experience. And now we're at the end of the video, which is the Q&A part. So I'm just gonna answer a bunch of different questions I got on Instagram. The first question I got was, what's your experience with other glues like tacky glue? I don't think I've used tacky glue before, but I have had a bit of a glue journey up to this point. To just adhere things, I would use Gorilla Glue Super Gel. Even though it gives the marketing appearance of being like a really strong glue, it's really not that strong. In my opinion, it's not that strong. I don't think it's actually a special jewelry glue, so I moved on to a specific kind of jewelry glue because jewelry glues tend to be more powerful. So the first brand I got was called Aleene's Jewelry Glue. Very affordable. I think I got it for like $2.50 or like $3 at Michael's. I remember reading a review for it that was like the truest thing ever. It said, "This glue is great if you only ever need to glue one thing ever." Basically, it just spurts out of the tube uncontrollably, no matter what I do. So what I do is I'll open the glue really quickly, squeeze a little bit out, and then cap it again really quickly. But basically the glue will build up over time, and then the cap just ends up getting glued to the bottle. It's just a huge mess. So that initially really irritated me because I just thought, okay, this is really hard to use and I don't like that it just spurts out of the bottle. So I moved on to the E6000 glue, which is an industrial glue, so it's supposed to be like very, very strong, and I also saw a lot of other artists using it. But turns out I think you have to use like a special mask when using it, which I just don't like because I feel like that's an extra hassle, and it needs a longer amount of time to cure, while the Aleene's Jewelry Glue is almost instant. It takes like 15 to 30 minutes to cure fully, but the E6000 takes like days. I didn't find that it had the industrial strength that it advertised, so I also didn't like that glue very much either. I eventually moved all the way back to the Aleene's Jewelry Glue. Even though she spurts out of the tube uncontrollably, it's kind of the best thing I have right now. It's also super affordable. The bond it creates is very strong. I remember once, for some reason, I was trying to remove the pin backing off of a clay pin, so a piece of clay, and I was pushing it, and I ended up never being able to remove the pin backing from the piece of clay because that's how strong it was. So I do recommend Aleene's Jewelry Glue, but with a grain of salt because I just haven't found anything better yet. The next question someone asked is earring stud brands. I'm afraid of mine tarnishing or oxidizing. So this is a really important question. The materials and the metals you use when you make earrings are very important, because various people are more sensitive to different kinds of metals. I like to use surgical steel because through my research I found that it's sort of one of the most hypoallergenic materials you can use. It tends to be more expensive than silver plated earring findings, but I find that it's worth it because I don't want anyone to have an allergic reaction or, like you're saying, tarnishing or oxidizing when they wear my earrings. I get most of my findings on Etsy. I've been shopping at this shop called Miss Val's Findings, and that's where I get my hooks from, but when it comes to the eye pins and the head pins, I kind of just shop around on different Etsy shops. I also always make sure to read the reviews because a lot of the times the people that are purchasing also have small earring businesses, so they'll leave reviews like, oh, this finding was great and I've never had any issues with my customers, and that kind of helps me have more confidence and it's just more reliable to me. Oftentimes I find when you go to shop on sites like Amazon, not only is, you know, Amazon an awful company, but sometimes these sellers on Amazon are not selling real surgical steel, and you can just scroll down to the reviews and find that people say, okay, this tarnished within 2 minutes of using it. So yeah, just be careful when you buy things off of Amazon as well. Another question is, what's something you wish you knew before starting clay? A couple things. The first thing, definitely be patient. I find that using any kind of craft supplies, there's going to be a learning curve, and the more you use it, the more you'll learn its quirks and different ways of just maneuvering it to work in your favor. Also, remember, you will naturally get better every time you use clay or any kind of crafting materials. Another thing is to keep in mind safety. Like I talked about UV resin before, in terms of glazes and things like UV resin, you gotta remember that a lot of crafts are just different kinds of chemical combinations, so it is worth it to do a bit more research on how to be safe when working with these materials. And lastly, remember that process is different for everybody and materials can be different for everybody too. I think when I was first starting out, I would hear some artists say, oh, I like this X glaze and it's amazing, it's my favorite thing, and then I would use it and find that it was super sticky, a bunch of pet hair got in it, and I would just really not like how it works. So yeah, I remember that if something works amazingly for some artists and it doesn't work great for you, that's okay. There's so many variables that go into how craft supplies function in different environments, so things are different for everybody and your process is your process. And yeah, another question is total estimate for supplies. This is obviously going to vary based on what brands you go for, the quality of the supplies you're looking for as well, and where you're shopping. But for me, if I were to sort of do a rough estimate, in order to make about 50 pairs of earrings, let's say, the clay I get is about $7 to $8. The earring findings can be around $8 as well, but that also really depends. The paint set is $30. Pliers can be a bit more pricey, so I think altogether they might be around $20 to $30. The clay cutters are more affordable, so if you're gonna get like 5 of them, they might be around $15. The glaze I use is a bit more pricey, so I think that's around $13. So I think altogether it's around $80, but yeah, it just really depends on the quantity of earrings you're making and what supplies you're buying. But for me to make about 50 earrings, I think it costs around $80 to $100. But also it varies for every batch, because things like pliers you only have to buy once. And the last question was, do you have designs in mind that you haven't made yet? No, I don't have any ideas in the bank currently, but I do think I want to take a little break from earring making, because I feel like I've been doing this same dangly look for a while, because that's kind of the only thing I know how to do. And I realized out there are so many different kinds of ways to make jewelry and clay earrings that aren't just in this vertical way. There's different kinds of shapes I can be making. There's different kinds of techniques to twist wire, different ways to wrap beads in wire. I think I'm gonna take a bit of break, maybe do a bit of YouTube research on how to do a bunch of different kinds of techniques, and get back to it later. That is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it was helpful to you. If you haven't already, give me a like, that helps me out a lot. Also subscribe if you want. And if you have any lingering questions that I didn't get to in this video, be sure to leave it in the comments and I'll do my best to get to it. If you have a certain way of making earrings that was different than me, feel free to leave that in the comments below too, because maybe someone out there will read it and find it really helpful. We can just get a diversity of experience in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!